There are stories people hold on to because they make the unknown feel softer, more manageable, almost peaceful. Stories that turn death into something gentle, something that doesn't disturb the mind too much. But this one does the opposite. It doesn't comfort you, it unsettles you. It places a question in front of you that most people would rather avoid. And the more you try to ignore it, the heavier it becomes. What if someone truly came back not to bring peace to the living, but to warn them? And what if that warning didn't come from a place of light, but from somewhere far more disturbing? Because this isn't just a story about dying, it's about what happens after. And more importantly, what happens when there is no longer any chance to undo what's already been done. The title might promise something shocking, but the deeper truth is this. The real fear isn't in the words of the letter itself. It's in the reason it had to be written at all. To understand that, you have to go back to a quiet convent in Germany, a place where life followed a predictable rhythm, where nothing unusual was expected to happen. It was the kind of place defined by routine and silence. But sometimes it's in places like that where nothing extraordinary is supposed to occur that something impossible breaks through. It started like any other morning, the kind that passes without leaving a trace. A nun had recently passed away, and the sisters were doing what they always did in such moments. They carefully sorted through her few belongings, keeping what mattered, setting aside what didn't. There was no sense of mystery, no anticipation of finding anything unusual, just quiet duty. And then they found it, an old letter, worn with time, its paper yellowed and fragile. The handwriting looked unsteady, as if written by someone struggling to hold on. At first glance, it didn't seem significant. There was no name attached, no clear indication of who had written it or why, just pages folded together as if they had been hidden or perhaps forgotten. But something about it felt off, not in an obvious or dramatic way. There was nothing visibly strange about it, yet there was a subtle hesitation, a quiet resistance that made you pause before opening it. Still, curiosity has a way of pushing past that hesitation. It rarely feels dangerous in the beginning, but sometimes it leads you somewhere you were never meant to go. So they opened it, and from that moment, everything changed. Not because the message was unclear, but because it was too clear, too direct, too certain. There was no doubt in the words, no uncertainty in the tone. It didn't ask questions. It didn't suggest possibilities. It declared something absolute. Clara, do not pray for me. I am condemned. And just like that, the room fell silent. Not the kind of silence filled with sound, but the kind that carries weight, the kind that doesn't belong in the world of the living. Because a letter is supposed to connect people. It's meant to carry a voice across distance, to bridge gaps between individuals. But this letter crossed something far more final. It crossed death itself. And that creates a problem you can't easily dismiss. Because if this letter is real, then it shouldn't exist at all. But it did. And that's where everything begins to unravel. Because the nun who discovered it didn't say she found it tucked away in a drawer or hidden inside a book. Her explanation was far stranger. She said the letter came to her in a dream. At first, that might sound easy to dismiss. Dreams are unpredictable, shaped by memory, imagination, fragments of thought. They don't always mean anything. They fade quickly once you wake up. But this wasn't like that. Because when she opened her eyes, the letter was still there, right beside her bed, exactly as she had seen it. Same pages, same handwriting, same message. And in that moment, what could have been explained away as imagination became something far more difficult to ignore. Because whatever this was, it hadn't stayed in the dream. It had crossed into reality. So the question becomes unavoidable. If the letter didn't belong to a dream anymore, then where did it come from? Who could have written something that appeared beyond the boundary of sleep and remained in the physical world? That's when a name finally emerges. Annie, a woman who had died years earlier, a woman the nun had once known personally, someone whose life had already ended, whose voice should have been completely out of reach. And yet, here it was, her message, her words, her warning, somehow delivered after death. But Annie wasn't trying to reconnect. She wasn't offering comfort, and she wasn't asking for prayers or forgiveness. What she was doing felt far more unsettling. She was issuing a warning, and what she claimed in that letter left no space for interpretation. I am lost forever. Take a moment to really sit with those words. They don't just describe a situation, they close it completely. There's no suggestion of change, no possibility of reversal, no second chance waiting somewhere ahead, just a final state that cannot be undone. And if that's true, then everything that follows in that letter isn't just a message, it's testimony. Testimony from a place where no message should ever come from. And that's exactly why it's so difficult to ignore. Because Annie doesn't stop at saying she's condemned, she explains how it happened. But not in the way most people would expect. When people imagine someone ending up in hell, they often think of extreme actions, violence, cruelty, or obvious wrongdoing. The kind of life that makes the outcome feel inevitable. But Annie's story doesn't begin there. In fact, it begins in a way that feels almost ordinary. She talks about her childhood, her family, her home, and nothing about it suggests anything unusual or tragic. There are no dramatic events, no clear turning points, no obvious signs of a life heading toward disaster. Instead, what she describes is something much quieter, the absence of God, not rejection in an aggressive sense, not open hostility, just absence, no prayer, no mass, no confession, nothing that connected her to anything spiritual. It wasn't a decision she made all at once. It was a slow shift, a gradual movement away from something until it simply stopped being part of her life at all. And that's where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because indifference doesn't feel dangerous. It doesn't feel like rebellion or rejection. It feels harmless, even reasonable. But Annie describes it differently. She describes it as the beginning of something that didn't seem like a problem at the time, but became one later. Much later, because when something important disappears slowly, you don't immediately notice what you've lost. You adjust, you adapt, you move forward as if nothing has changed. And that's exactly what she did. Over time, religion became distant, then irrelevant, and eventually something she found irritating. She even explains that words like grace, church, and prayer started to make her uncomfortable, not because she had deeply examined them and rejected them, but because she had grown unfamiliar with them. And unfamiliar things often feel uncomfortable. Uncomfortable things are easy to avoid, and the things we avoid long enough eventually disappear from our lives entirely. But here's the part she emphasizes, the part that changes how you understand everything. She wasn't forced into this. She chose it, not in one dramatic decision, but in small, consistent ways. And those small choices didn't vanish after they were made. They built on each other. They formed patterns. And over time, those patterns became who she was. But while she was alive, she didn't see it that way. From the outside, her life looked completely normal. She had relationships, responsibilities, routines. She worked, she socialized, she got married. There was nothing about her life that would have made anyone think something was wrong. And that's what makes her story so unsettling. Because if something had been obviously broken, it might have been fixed, but nothing looked broken. Everything looked fine. And that illusion allowed everything else to continue. Because once you start believing that everything is fine, you stop questioning it. And when you stop questioning, you stop changing. That's how a direction quietly becomes permanent without ever feeling urgent. Annie didn't suddenly collapse into a different life. She drifted into it. And at some point along that path, she made a decision that seemed small at the time, almost insignificant, but it would shape everything that followed. She stopped praying, not out of anger, not out of rejection, not because she had anything against it. She simply lost interest. It no longer felt necessary, and that detail matters far more than it appears on the surface. Because in her own words, prayer wasn't something difficult or demanding. It was the simplest step toward God, the easiest connection she had, and she let it go, which means she didn't walk away from something complicated. She walked away from something accessible, something within reach. And from that point forward, every step she took moved her in one direction further away. But here's where the story becomes even more revealing. Even as she moved away from God, she didn't stop believing altogether. She replaced that belief with something else, something she created for herself, a version of truth that didn't challenge her, didn't require anything from her, didn't demand change. She chose to believe in reincarnation, not because it was certain, not because it was proven, but because it felt comfortable, because it removed the idea of final consequences, because it delayed accountability, because it made everything feel open-ended, as if there would always be another chance later. And that's the moment where belief stops being about truth and starts being about preference. Because if what you believe never challenges you, never corrects you, never asks anything of you, then it isn't guiding you, it's following you. It's shaped around what you want to hear, not what you need to face. And Annie followed that version of belief all the way to the end of her life. At first, that ending didn't seem like an ending at all. The day she died began peacefully. The sky was clear, the air was warm, and she was driving with her husband. There was nothing unusual about it. No warning signs, no sense that something irreversible was about to happen. It felt like any other day. And that's important to notice, because the most defining moments in life rarely announce themselves in advance. They don't come with signals or preparation. They arrive quietly, and then everything changes in an instant. The accident happens suddenly, a brief moment, a flash, a loss of control, and then impact. In less than a second, everything she had believed, everything she had ignored, everything she had postponed caught up with her, but not in the way she expected. Because she didn't enter darkness. She entered light, a light so intense, so overwhelming, that it didn't just illuminate what was around her, it revealed everything within her, every choice, every moment, every opportunity she had overlooked or dismissed. It all became visible at once. And this is where the story becomes impossible to dismiss, because she doesn't describe that moment as confusion or fear. She describes it as clarity. Perfect clarity. There were no excuses left, no way to reinterpret her life, no way to convince herself of something different. Every illusion was gone, every justification disappeared. What remained was truth unfiltered and undeniable. And that truth wasn't what she had hoped it would be. It was what she had chosen. Everything she had become, every direction she had followed, every decision she had repeated, it all stood before her in that light, complete and undeniable. But what she did next is where everything shifts. Because instead of moving toward that light, instead of accepting it, she ran from it. And the reason why she ran is what changes everything. Because to understand that reaction, you have to understand what that light revealed, not just about her life, but about who she had become. Because the light didn't just show her actions. It didn't simply replay moments from her life like memories on display. It revealed something deeper. It revealed the state of her soul, what she had become through every decision, every omission, and every quiet turning away from what she once knew. And that is the part people don't expect. We usually think of judgment as something external, something delivered from outside ourselves, like a verdict pronounced by someone else. But Annie describes it differently. For her, it wasn't imposed from outside. It was revealed from within, as if everything she had chosen throughout her life had finally formed into something she could no longer escape. In that light, there were no distractions left, no background noise, no comforting illusions, nothing to soften the truth, only clarity, sharp, absolute, and unchanging. And the truth was simple. She did not belong there. Not because she was rejected at the beginning, but because she had slowly shaped herself into someone who could no longer accept that reality. Every step she took away from spiritual life, every moment of neglect, every choice that seemed harmless at the time, it all formed a direction. And that direction became identity. So when she says she fled from the light, it wasn't because she misunderstood it. It wasn't confusion. It was recognition. She saw what it meant. She saw what it revealed, and she understood that remaining in its presence was no longer something she could endure. And that is where the story takes a turn most people struggle with. because Annie describes hell not as something she was dragged into against her will, but something she moved toward through a lifetime of consistent choices. Not one dramatic decision, not one catastrophic mistake, but a pattern, a direction, a series of small refusals that eventually became final. And that changes how the entire story must be understood, because it means the most important part of her experience didn't happen at death. It happened long before it, in ordinary moments, in decisions that seemed too small to matter, in habits that felt harmless, in delays that felt temporary. She explains that there was no dramatic line she crossed in a single moment. Instead, there was a gradual alignment between what she was choosing and what she was becoming. And by the time she reached the end of her life, that alignment was complete. Then came the final words, "Depart from me," not spoken with rage, not accompanied by spectacle, but final, absolute, irreversible. And what followed, according to her, wasn't a dramatic descent or physical imagery of falling. It was something far more internal, a separation, a breaking of connection at the deepest level of existence. She describes it as being locked inside a will that could no longer change, a state where choice itself had become fixed. Not because change was refused from outside, but because it no longer existed within. And in that condition, something else took hold. Hatred. Not the kind of anger people experience in everyday life. Not emotional frustration or temporary rage. Something far deeper, something permanent. Something that shaped every thought, every perception, every awareness. Hatred for others. Hatred for everything around her. And most disturbingly, hatred directed toward God Himself. At first, this raises a question that feels almost impossible to answer. Why would anyone hate the source of goodness? Why would anyone reject what, in theory, could bring peace or restoration? But Annie's explanation turns that question upside down. She says it isn't born from ignorance. It isn't because they don't see the truth. It's because they do. In that state, there is no confusion, no doubt, no misunderstanding. The reality of God is completely known. His goodness is fully seen. His perfection is undeniable. And that is precisely why the reaction becomes hatred. Because when absolute goodness is fully understood, it also exposes everything that is not good, everything that falls short, everything that resists it. And once that contrast is fully revealed, it cannot be softened anymore. It can only be rejected. And that rejection becomes permanent not because mercy is absent, but because the will no longer turns back. And that is where Annie's testimony becomes something more than a story. It becomes a warning about what happens when direction is left unchecked long enough to become identity. Because at that point, according to Annie, something fundamental changes in the nature of the soul. It is no longer in a state of movement or growth. It no longer shifts between choices or possibilities. Instead, it becomes fixed in what it has already chosen, unable to step outside of itself. And that is where the idea of eternity takes on a meaning most people never consider. Eternity is often imagined as endless time stretching forward like an infinite line with no end. But Annie describes something different, not a timeline, but a condition, a state of being that does not evolve, does not soften, and does not move forward in any meaningful way. It simply is, permanently. In that condition, she explains that fire is not symbolic. It is real, but not in the way people usually imagine. It does not consume the body. It does not end existence. Instead, it affects something deeper. It touches the soul itself, a burning that does not destroy, a suffering that does not stop, a torment that continues without interruption. And what makes it unbearable, according to her account, is not only the pain itself, but the complete absence of relief. There is no rest, no pause, no sleep, no distraction, nothing that allows distance from awareness, only constant consciousness of what has been lost, and that awareness becomes part of the suffering. Because memory does not fade in that state. It does the opposite. It becomes sharper. Every moment of grace that was ignored returns with clarity. Every opportunity that was dismissed reappears without distortion. Every decision that could have led somewhere different becomes permanently visible, but there is no ability to return to any of it. No correction, no repair, no second chance. Only understanding without the power to change anything. And that is what makes it unbearable. But Annie's testimony goes even further, because one might assume that even in such a condition, there could still be some form of connection between souls, some shared understanding, some sense of companionship in suffering, but she completely rejects that idea. She describes absolute isolation. Even in the presence of others, there is no connection, no communication that heals, no empathy that bridges the gap between individuals. Every soul is locked within itself, consumed entirely by its own state. There is no friendship, no compassion, no love of any kind. Only separation. And that isolation is not external, it is internal. Each person is unable to reach beyond their own condition, trapped within the consequences of what they have become. In contrast to everything we associate with joy, connection, unity, shared meaning, this state moves in the opposite direction. It collapses inward. It isolates. It reduces existence to a single point, the self and the reality it can no longer escape. And yet, even within this account, something unexpected appears. Annie claims that she is still compelled to speak truthfully. Even in that state, even against her will, she cannot lie or distort reality. There is a force of truth that remains absolute, even when everything else is fractured. That detail is crucial, because it suggests that even in separation, there is still order. Even in rebellion, there is still authority. Even in loss, truth itself is not erased. And that truth becomes the reason she is writing this letter at all. Not out of love, not out of hope, not out of compassion, but out of compulsion. She is not writing because she wants to. She is writing because she cannot do otherwise. And that raises a deeper question that the story cannot avoid anymore. If this message truly comes from beyond death, then why is it being delivered to the living? Why allow a warning like this to cross the boundary between worlds? The answer, according to the interpretation of this account, is not meant to comfort. It is meant to interrupt, because fear alone fades. Emotion alone fades. But truth, when it is understood, has the power to redirect a life. And that is where the purpose of Annie's message begins to turn outward, away from her suffering and toward those who are still alive, toward those who still have time, toward those who are still in motion, still changing, still capable of turning in a different direction. Because according to her, that is the only thing that truly matters now, whether direction can still be changed before it becomes permanent. And that brings the story back to the living. Because Annie's message doesn't end with her experience, it circles directly into the present, into those who are still capable of choosing differently. She makes one thing painfully clear. She knew enough while she was alive. Not everything, not with perfect understanding, but enough to recognize the direction she was moving in. She felt the warnings. She experienced moments of awareness where something inside her quietly suggested she should stop, reflect, reconsider. But she didn't act on them. She moved past them. She delayed. She assumed there would always be more time. And that assumption is what eventually defined everything. Because time, as she describes it, is not just something that passes. It is something that shapes decisions through repetition. Small choices become habits. Habits become patterns. And patterns eventually become identity. By the time a person realizes what has happened, the direction often already feels natural, even comfortable. That is what makes her story so unsettling. Not that she made one catastrophic mistake, but that she didn't. She simply continued steadily in one direction without ever fully stopping to question where it was leading. And that is where the warning becomes personal. Because Annie's life didn't look broken from the outside. It looked ordinary. She had relationships, responsibilities, structure, normal routines. Nothing appeared extreme or alarming. And that illusion of normality is what allowed everything to continue without interruption. This is where the danger lies, not in dramatic rebellion, but in quiet indifference, not in active rejection, but in passive neglect. not in saying no outright, but in never truly saying yes. Because when nothing feels urgent, nothing gets corrected. And when nothing gets corrected, everything continues as it is, slowly, quietly, until one day it no longer can. Annie didn't believe her choices mattered in the moment. Individually, they seemed too small to carry weight, too ordinary to have consequences. But over time, those small decisions accumulated into something permanent, something she could no longer reverse. And that permanence is the core of her warning. Because right now, as she describes it, movement is still possible, direction is still flexible, change is still available, nothing is fully fixed yet, but that state does not last forever. At some point, according to her account, movement stops becoming temporary and becomes final. And once that happens, reversal is no longer part of the equation. That is why her letter does not ask for sympathy. It does not request remembrance. It does not even ask for prayer. It states something direct, almost final in tone. Do not pray for me. Because in her words, it changes nothing. And that is the line that forces the real question onto the viewer, not about her, but about themselves. If there is a point where change is no longer possible, then the only meaningful question is whether that point has already been approached without realizing it. But the uncomfortable truth is that no one is given a clear marker. There is no visible line that announces when a life shifts from open to fixed, no obvious moment that signals when direction becomes irreversible. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes the story so difficult to ignore, because it doesn't provide a date, it doesn't offer a timeline, it only presents direction, and direction, by nature, can only be changed while movement is still happening. So the question becomes less about belief and more about awareness, less about fear and more about attention. If life continues exactly as it is right now, without reflection, without adjustment, without change, then where does that path lead? And more importantly, will it even be recognized while it is happening? Because Annie's story does not end in the past. It continues as a reflection of present choices. Choices that feel small in the moment but become significant over time. Choices that don't seem final until suddenly they are. And that is why her message returns to one central idea. Not everything important announces itself loudly. Some of the most critical turning points in life are quiet, almost invisible, but they still shape everything that follows. So the final question is not whether this story is frightening, it is whether it is taken seriously enough to create reflection, because if it is ignored, it simply becomes another story. But if it is understood, it becomes something else entirely, a reminder that direction is still in your hands, but only for as long as you are still moving.